The shadow of the Undertaker creeps across your floor.
My name is Bo Metorne, and I'm the director of the animated short film, The Backwater Gospel. At the time, I was listening a lot to a couple of bands, one called Sons of Perdition and one called Those Poor Bastards, that both play sort of dark country style music. Those Poor Bastards especially notable for this very, very rough, very distorted sound. Sons of Perdition more of a very, very gloomy, Old Testamental, very folklorian take on sort of American mythology. And I was very inspired by those bands, and I wanted to see if I could make it a 3D animated character that would somehow capture the roughness and the darkness, but also this kind of like slightly humorous or sarcastic feeling the music had. I was listening a lot to a couple of bands at the time, one called Sons of Perdition, another one called Those Poor Bastards. So I thought I was going to try to make a character that would embody the voice of Those Poor Bastards, this very, very dark and wild and distorted sound. So I made this hobo character in classic Norman Rockwell style, but of course with a much darker twist. And as I was working on him, I decided that the other character that I would do would be an Undertaker, because it seemed to fit the style and also the universe that Those Poor Bastards and Sons of Perdition were sort of working in. And while one day I was talking with a friend about this Undertaker, and I said that it would be really interesting if he would show up just before someone died. And that made me realize that that's an interesting plot mechanism or plot device to have this dark omen. And if it's something that everyone else believes in and it has always been this way, then I thought if he was one day to show up and no one would die, then obviously that would create a lot of tension. And if the longer no one dies, the more tension would build. And I'm sure you could figure out ways to resolve that tension in interesting and dark ways. So I thought that seemed like an interesting universe because it had some elements of the supernatural, and it really seemed to mesh really well with, again, the music I was listening to at the time, and this atmosphere that I wanted to explore, and this whole thing that it's superstitious, it's dark, it's mythological. Yes, I was experimenting with ways to change my approach to 3D characters. Because I felt 3D had it felt more rigid than I liked. It always had this solidity to it, and there was something. The pipeline is fairly rigid. It's you typically do your concept art, then you do your 3D model, then you unwrap, flatten that 3D model, then you paint your textures on it, and then you eventually rig it, as it's called, like you put a skeleton in and then you pose it and animate it. And I thought it was not that there's anything wrong with that approach, but it led to, I think, a certain outcome. So I had this idea that I could at least flip some of that around and try to introduce more of this looseness that I like in traditional drawing. And at the time I had been experimenting a bit with taking hand-drawn illustrations and putting those into a 3D scene and adding a little bit of a geometry to it, just so you looked at something that was very clearly a hand-drawn illustration, but you could move the camera a little bit. And I thought there was something interesting about the unexpectedness of the 3D perspective in something that otherwise just looked like a flat illustration. I think a lot of people have felt some of the same need to shake up 3D a bit, and I think people agreed that this was an interesting approach to it. I certainly didn't want it to be, I didn't want it to be a simple message of just religion being a bad thing and religious people being evil and the church being an evil institution and all that. As I said, it was, I think, if if anything, I've been conflicted or struggling with religious ideas. So I wanted at least to have some nuance to it. So I think in the end it's more of a statement against dogmatic thinking and sort of against mob behavior, and especially against this. At least I didn't want it to be a simple religion is bad and religious people are evil story. I wanted it to have more nuance than that. Definitely the most challenging thing was just how much story we wanted to tell in very little time. We had a number of characters we had to introduce. We had a mythology and a universe as such to introduce, and then we set up a mythology. Then we had to break that mythology and then show everyone's reaction to that, and then have it all escalate into something that was extreme but also had to feel somewhat cohesive to the rest of the story. The music was absolutely fundamental to the project, and of course not least because Zebulon Watley from Sons of Perdition actually ended up being quite heavily involved with the project. I had written him in the early stages of the project when all I had was a couple of those 2 early characters and a bit of an outline of the story. I told him that I was a big fan of his music and I was working on this short film that was very inspired by his work. And I just asked him if he wanted to be involved in any way. Of course, my most lofty ambition was that he would eventually write some music for the film, but also just having someone who is born and raised in Texas, really knows the universe and really knows the frame we're working within well, that could help me sort of steer everything and get all the idiosyncrasies correct and all that. The actual song about the Undertaker ended up being just a perfect folklore or folk song that really exactly matched what I had in mind, and it's been a real joy to see how popular it's become also outside of the movie. Yeah, the music that inspired the film is fairly niche, so in that way it's a little interesting or a little surprising that it ended up being as popular as it has been. I think there was the initial feedback that I got for those 2 characters that I originally did was really positive. So I thought, okay, at least visually there was people were gonna be interested in what we were doing. And I think basically from the moment Zebulon said he was interested, I felt like, okay, we're starting to have all the pieces we need to make something that really will come together. Of course, as I said, I tremendously doubted the validity of the film most of the project. But I'm happy, of course, to see that it came together as well as it did. So after I graduated from the animation workshop, which is where we made the short film, I was freelancing for a few years with movies or animated movies and video games, and I also did quite a lot of teaching. And eventually I was hired as an art director at a Danish game developer, game studio. And I quit that job in 2018, actually to get back to animation. I did a small thing for Hulu and a music video for Jedi Mind Tricks. And I started on a new short film about this quantum physicist who has lost his child and is really struggling with dealing with that grief. But I was eventually sidetracked from that project when a good friend of mine who also worked in the video game industry had quit his job and asked me if I wanted to team up and do a little game together. And this was 2020 and the pandemic was going on and there was basically nothing else to do. So we started on this game that we eventually managed to sell to a publisher. And the game is out and being updated, and we're still part of that development process now. I still think a lot about animation, and I still keep getting ideas that I feel will only work in an animated movie setting. But I think what draws me so much to video games is how it's the fact that you're producing a product that you can sell on a marketplace. But at the same time, there's also things that video games obviously can do that movies are not able to do. And I think I'm just I'm hoping one day to really find a way to combine those two